more actively engaged than the international community. The second point I wanted to make is that I think here there is yet another lesson for the ambitions that the government claims to have in relation to a global Britain post-Brexit. If we are to increase our resources in the Foreign Office, and if we are to have a more active international policy, then I believe it has to have human rights and atrocity prevention at its core. We have that responsibility in the UN Security Council, but we also have it as a nation, given our historical responsibilities for our colonial past. And I believe that the government must ensure that human rights and atrocity prevention are at the heart of the new policy of Global Britain. And I would be interested to know in the Minister's response this evening what the government have assessed in relation to atrocity prevention, and what has been the approach of, for example, the responsibility to protect focal point in the Foreign Office. What is their response and their attitude to this situation, and how much worse it could become? The third point I wanted to make is in relation to the, I think, crucial politics of this situation. And I want to generalise here far beyond the Cameroon. Because if we look around the world today, almost every major conflict today is based on an identity clash between a majority and a minority. Much of them created by borders that were defined either by the end of World War I or by the end of colonisation in the 50s and the early 60s. But many of them elsewhere still raging without any engagement of any of the European former colonial powers. And if we look at Myanmar, or we look at the Philippines, where I have been involved as an advisor to the peace process in Mindanao, registered in my Lord's Register of Interests, or we look at the former Soviet states in the Ukraine and elsewhere, or we look in the Middle East, or we look across large parts of Africa in medium-sized and large states, we see a conflict today between a majority and a minority, where the minority, rightly or wrongly, in most cases rightly, feels persecuted and disadvantaged by the majority, and where the majority fear the minority and therefore will not concede power. And it seems to me that the system that was, at least in theory, designed for the Cameroon back in the late 50s and early 1960s, and that prompted the decision of the southern Cameroonians to choose being part of Cameroon rather than Nigeria in that plebiscite, that system of a federated government has to be the kind of political solution that has to exist around, be promoted around the world, in order to ensure that these conflicts are not just contained, but are actually resolved in the long term. Unless people have a political voice, a representation of their identity, and an opportunity to govern themselves and influence the rest of the country in an appropriate way, then these conflicts and the underlying causes of them will not end. Whether that's in some parts of Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, in the former Soviet states, Southeast Asia, or anywhere else. And I think the British government, along perhaps with other European partners, could be making a more effective intervention on this. We have a history of devolution and a political settlement in Northern Ireland, bringing to an end a violent conflict there. And we have a history in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK of creating political devolution in a peaceful way. And in both of these instances, we have lessons that we could take elsewhere in the world and use to help prevent conflict and sustain peace. And I think perhaps as part of this global Britain approach that we're promised post-Brexit, that is one of the initiatives that could be at its heart.
My Lords, may I firstly congratulate Lord Boateng on giving us the opportunity to raise these issues concerning Cameroon, which are so important in our overall philosophy of the development of Africa. My Lord, since independence in 1961, there followed a long period of economic migration back and forth between Cameroon and Nigeria, together with asylum seekers fleeing from Boko Haram, perhaps inevitably in the war between Cameroon's army and the Islamist militant group. But since 2015, Cameroon has forcibly removed, apparently, tens of thousands of asylum seekers back to northeast Nigeria, despite warnings that the region remains unsafe from Boko Haram attacks, and in March 2017, concerns about forced returns led Nigeria, Cameroon and the UNHCR to sign an agreement for the voluntary repatriation of Nigerian refugees living in Cameroon. The agreement states, my lords, that repatriation of Nigerian refugees will be done solely on the basis of their freely expressed will, and will only be done when the conditions are favourable for the return of the refugees in safety and dignity to the place of their final destination in Nigeria. Yet in September 2017, Human Rights Watch reported that over 100,000 Nigerian refugees were deported from Cameroon in the hope of stemming the spread of Boko Haram, defying a plea from the UN Refugee Agency not to return anyone to northeast Nigeria, where Boko Haram had killed thousands of people. Again, according to Human Rights Watch, the Cameroonian military torture and abuse of Nigerian refugees seems to be driven by an arbitrary decision to punish them for Boko Haram attacks in Cameroon and to discourage Nigerians from seeking asylum. It is still not safe to drive from Cameroon into places like the border towns of Pulka and Banki, say leaders of the Borneo Community Coalition, who assist IDPs. This is the Borno Community Coalition.